Welcome to Fogman Stories. Have you ever been completely alone and yet felt like someone was right there beside you? Or perhaps met someone just for a brief moment, only to realize later they vanished without a trace? Imagine how you would feel in that moment. Confused, curious, or deeply unsettled. Today, I want to share with you a true story. One that happened to a woman who often prayed alone at midnight in a quiet, old chapel in Spain. What unfolded there was something deeply spiritual, something mysterious, something that, even today, no one can fully explain. Who was the stranger that entered her prayers and then disappeared? Was it a wandering soul seeking intercession? Or was it an angel in disguise? Join me as we step into the story together. And if you enjoyed this kind of spiritual mystery, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to Fogman Stories, where true Catholic spiritual tales come to life. Chapter 1. The Stillness of the Chapel. I don't remember exactly when I started praying at midnight. I suppose it began not long after my husband, Emiliano, passed away. Sleep became a stranger to me after that, something I chased but could never quite catch. The nights stretched long and thin, like a rosary drawn taut between trembling fingers. So instead of lying in bed waiting for morning, I found myself walking the narrow path to the chapel. Our village sits tucked in the northern hills of Castilla y León, where winters arrive early and linger long. The air here carries the scent of wood smoke, old stone, and damp earth. Most homes close their shutters by 9, and by 10, the streets are blanketed in silence. It is a quiet place, the kind that holds onto echoes. The chapel stands at the edge of town, half hidden by a grove of wind-stunted pines. It's not much to look at, a squat stone building with a wooden bell tower and a roof that sags a little on one side. But it has stood for more than 2 centuries, and inside, it still feels sacred. The wooden pews creak under the weight of memory. The waxy scent of extinguished candles clings to the walls. And the light is always soft here, even when only one candle is lit. I don't unlock the chapel. There's no need. The key was entrusted to me years ago, when Father Javier moved to a parish in Leon and left our village with only visiting priests. Since then, I've kept it safe and used it when I needed to. Which, lately, has been every night. That particular night, I remember the cold biting sharper than usual. My coat did little to stop the wind as I crossed the path. I pulled my scarf higher, tucking it beneath my chin, and cradled my lantern in both hands. Its glow flickered faintly on the frost-lined ground, casting long, thin shadows that danced at the edges of the trees. When I opened the chapel door, the hinges groaned like an old man rising from prayer. The scent inside was familiar: beeswax, pinewood, and something older, something faintly metallic, like old brass. I lit 3 candles at the altar, one for the souls in purgatory, one for Emiliano, and one for those who had no one left to pray for them. It was a habit I'd picked up over the years. Something about the act of lighting a flame felt like resistance against the dark. I knelt at my usual pew, the one closest to the statue of Saint Joseph holding the child Jesus. The wood beneath my knees was cold but familiar. I crossed myself, let out a long breath, and reached for my rosary. That was when I felt it. A stillness, not the ordinary kind, not the comforting hush of an empty chapel, but something else, a weight to the air, as though the space around me had thickened, become more substantial. I looked up. The candles flickered, though there was no draft. The windows were shut tight. I remember glancing toward the statue of Saint Joseph. For a moment, just a breath, I thought his face looked different. Not change, exactly, but more focused, as though he were watching me. I closed my eyes. I was tired. I told myself I'd skipped dinner again, lost track of time reading the letters Emiliano had written me years ago. Perhaps I was simply worn down by the ache of remembering. I began the rosary, Hail Mary, full of grace. My voice was a whisper, swallowed by the stone walls. I made it through the first decade, then paused, letting the silence settle over me. It was in that moment, that fragile breath between prayers, that I heard it. 3 soft knocks, not loud, not hurried, not the banging of someone in distress. Just 3 deliberate taps. I froze. My fingers tightened around the rosary. I turned slowly, my eyes moving to the door. Nothing. The chapel door remained closed. The shadows held still. Even the candles, moments ago flickering, now stood steady. I waited. Nothing came. No footsteps. No voice. I stood up. Every instinct told me to ignore it, to return to prayer and leave it be. But something deeper, something older, urged me forward. I approached the door, my steps cautious, heart thudding against my ribs. I reached out and slowly unlatched it. Cold air swept in, but no one was there. No prints on the frost-covered path. No figures in the trees. Just stillness, heavy and deep. And yet, I knew I hadn't imagined it. The sound had been real, intentional, like someone asking, with gentleness and patience, to be let in. So I did something strange. I stepped aside, just a little, enough to make room, as if inviting someone to enter. Then I returned to my pew. The air inside the chapel felt different now. Not colder, not threatening, just full. I didn't hear the door close behind me, but when I glanced back, it was shut, and in the far corner of the chapel, the darkest part, I saw a shape. Seated, head bowed. Someone was there, and I was no longer alone. Chapter 2. The Man in the Shadow. He did not enter with noise. There was no slam of the chapel door, no heavy steps on the wooden floorboards, only a subtle shift in the air, as though the night itself had stepped inside and taken a seat in the corner. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. I had returned to my prayers, trying to calm the tremble in my hands after the knocks on the door. My voice had gone quiet, and I found myself listening more than speaking. It was then that I sensed him, not saw, not heard, but sensed, a weight in the space, a presence that hadn't been there before. When I finally lifted my gaze, he was already seated, in the last pew, near the entrance. The shadows pooled around him, softening his shape, but I could see enough. A man, tall, wrapped in a long dark coat, perhaps wool or something heavier. Like a traveling cloak, his face was turned slightly downward, obscured by the hood or collar. I couldn't be sure, But there was no fear in me, just curiosity, a still, delicate kind. I turned slightly and offered a quiet greeting. "Good evening." He did not respond with words. He simply inclined his head, a small, respectful gesture, then returned to his stillness. I watched him for a moment longer. His hands rested on his lap, one lightly over the other. No movement, no shifting, just the posture of someone accustomed to silence. So I returned to my prayer. Each Hail Mary felt heavier now, each breath slower. The air had thickened again, not oppressively, but meaningfully, as though something sacred hovered just beyond the visible. Minutes passed, I do not know how many. In the chapel, time becomes a strange thing. It does not tick or march forward. It lingers. Then I heard it, a voice, not loud, not urgent, a whisper, male, ancient, Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. The Latin filled the space like incense, not shouted, not sung, but breathed. My skin prickled. It wasn't the words that unsettled me. I'd heard them 1,000 times in Mass. It was how he said them, slowly, with sorrow, with longing. I opened my eyes. The man remained still, his head bowed, hands now joined together. Dona nobis pacem, he whispered, and just like that, the temperature seemed to shift. A cool breath passed through the chapel, not a wind, not enough to stir my scarf, but enough to flicker the candles. I glanced toward the windows. Closed, sealed, the flames danced anyway. And then the smell, not unpleasant, just different, like burnt frankincense, richer, older. The scent filled the corners of the chapel. Though I hadn't lit any new incense that night, my throat tightened, my eyes watered. I looked back toward the man. He had not moved, but somehow I knew he was aware of me. There's a kind of awareness that lives outside the body, a knowing that isn't bound by eye contact or speech. That's what I felt, as if his soul had gently brushed against mine. I didn't speak. I didn't want to disturb whatever sacred rhythm had begun between us. Prayer, silence, presence. He remained like that for a long time. Perhaps 30 minutes, perhaps more. Neither of us looked at the other. Neither of us moved. It was as if we were sharing something deeper than conversation, as if our prayers were folding into each other, like streams meeting in a river. And then, he stood, gracefully, slowly, with the care of someone who did not want to startle the silence. He stepped out from the pew, walked down the center aisle, not looking side to side, and stopped just before the altar. He didn't kneel, he didn't raise his hands. He only bowed his head, a long, solemn bow, and in that bow was something I cannot quite name. Reverence, yes, but also sorrow, a deep, aching kind, the kind of sorrow that knows loss intimately, that has knelt beside graves, that has whispered prayers in the dark for years. He stayed like that for a moment, perhaps two. Then, without turning to me, without a word, he walked back up the aisle and toward the door. My heart beat hard in my chest. I wanted to speak, to ask his name, to offer peace, but all I could manage, barely above a whisper, was, "The Lord be with you." And in the hush that followed, just before the door opened, I thought I heard him respond, "Et cum spiritu tuo." But when I turned to look again, he was gone. No sound, no steps, No echo, only stillness remained, and the candles, once flickering wildly, had returned to calm, as if nothing and everything had just passed through. Chapter 3. No trace in the snow. I didn't move for a long time after he left. My hands stayed in my lap, my head slightly bowed, the rosary still coiled between my fingers. I sat there, suspended in the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but full, thick, like air before a storm, but softer, calmer, as though the chapel itself had taken a breath and was holding it with me. Eventually, I stood, slowly. My knees ached from the cold of the wooden floor, and my legs felt reluctant to carry the weight of what had just happened. I walked to the back of the chapel, glancing toward the last pew where he had sat. The wood still bore the faint impression of his presence, or maybe that was just in my mind. I reached out and touched it, half expecting it to be warm. It wasn't, just smooth, cool wood. I turned to the door. The wind outside had picked up slightly. I could hear it pressing gently against the heavy chapel door, making the hinges creak just faintly, as if the night itself was curious. When I stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was the snow. It had begun falling while I was inside. Fine, quiet snow, the kind that seems to drift more than fall. Like it's searching for the perfect place to land. It blanketed everything, the path, the steps, the surrounding trees, all tucked beneath a thin, fresh sheet of white. I stepped down slowly, my boots crunching softly into the snow. The sound echoed slightly in the stillness. And then I looked. There were no footprints, none, except mine. I saw clearly the pattern of my boots from when I arrived, coming up the stone path. Turning toward the door, a slight hesitation where I paused before entering. But nothing else. No second set leading up to the chapel. No prints walking away. I stood frozen, eyes scanning the untouched snow again and again. Perhaps I had missed something. Perhaps the wind had covered his tracks. But no, the snow was too light, too gentle. It had only just begun to settle. There should have been something. But there wasn't. I turned, slowly, taking in the landscape. To my left, the trees stood motionless, their dark arms dusted with white. To my right, the stone wall that bordered the chapel grounds, bare, cold, and undisturbed. The village lights were barely visible in the distance, tiny golden flickers behind shuttered windows. But here in the chapel yard, everything was silent, still, pristine, and yet someone had been with me, hadn't he? I pressed my hand to my chest. My heart was still steady, though slower now. My breath formed soft clouds in the cold air, rising and fading quickly. I didn't feel afraid. That surprised me. I should have been unnerved. A stranger appeared, prayed, and vanished, leaving no trace. But there was no fear, only wonder, and something deeper, a sense that I had witnessed something not meant for explanation. A moment folded between the pages of time, a sacred interruption. I turned back to the chapel. Its old stones looked even older in the snowlight. The bell tower, quiet and solemn, stood like a sentinel over what had just passed. I stepped inside once more. The warmth, if it could be called that, was subtle. The candles were still burning, their flames steady now, The scent of incense had faded into something fainter. Like memory, I walked slowly to the front pew and knelt. My rosary still hung from my wrist. I wrapped it fully in my hands again and bowed my head. The words of the prayer returned not in order, not in structure, but in feeling. "Blessed are you, Lord," I whispered, "for mysteries we do not understand, for moments we are allowed to witness, for the nearness of heaven, when it chooses to draw close." I stayed like that for a long while. Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and unhurried. Inside, I prayed, not because I was seeking answers, but because I had been part of something, and that was enough. Chapter 4. The Priest's Confirmation. The morning light crept through my curtains like a hesitant guest. I had not slept. I had lain awake, eyes tracing the lines of the ceiling, replaying the night in my mind again and again. The knock, the man, the prayers, the silence, the snow, and most of all, the absence of footprints. By the time the church bells tolled 8, I had already dressed, brewed a cup of strong coffee, and wrapped myself in my heaviest coat. The frost on the windows hadn't melted, and outside, the village was still cloaked in a thin layer of snow. My boots left deep, fresh impressions as I walked toward the rectory. Father Miguel had served our parish for more than 20 years. A gentle man with silver hair and eyes that always seemed to be searching further than the horizon. He lived alone in the small house beside the chapel, where the garden grew wild with herbs in the summer and lay frozen in the winter months. I found him outside, brushing snow off the stone steps with a broom, moving slowly but steadily. "Buenos dias, Padre," I called softly. He turned, smiling with that quiet warmth he always carried. "Marta, you're up early. I need to speak with you," I said. His smile faded, replaced with a look of gentle concern. He motioned me inside. We sat in his study, a small room lined with books, icons, and the soft ticking of an old clock. A pot of tea warmed on a small stove in the corner. I wrapped my hands around the cup he offered, more for the comfort than the heat. I told him everything, every detail, from the moment I arrived at the chapel to the knock on the door, to the man who entered without leaving a trace. I spoke slowly, not wanting to sound dramatic or foolish, but knowing full well how strange it all sounded. Father Miguel listened without interrupting. He sat very still, his eyes fixed on me, not with skepticism but with an unsettling depth. When I finished, he took a long breath. "And you're sure you saw him?" "I did, Father," I said. "He sat there, he prayed. I heard him say the Agnus Dei." His voice, it wasn't like anything I've heard before. It was heavy with sorrow, beautiful, but sad. He nodded slowly, and there were no footprints, only mine. I checked, twice. He rose from his chair and walked to the cabinet in the corner. From a small drawer, he withdrew a key, not to the chapel, but to the cabinet of security records. Years ago, when petty theft had become a problem in the area, a visiting priest had suggested they install a discreet camera at the chapel door. Only one, only at the entrance. Father Miguel retrieved the small screen from the drawer below, plugged it in, and scrolled through the footage from the night before. There I was, arriving just before midnight, the snow already beginning to fall, the lantern in my hand casting long shadows across the steps. And then, nothing. No second figure, no movement at the door, nothing but the faint shimmer of snowfall and the quiet emptiness of night. We watched the footage twice. Nothing changed. "Marta," he said gently, "you were alone." I sat back, hands tightening around the teacup. "No," I whispered, "I wasn't." He looked at me then with something deeper than doubt, a kind of reverent caution. "What did you feel when he was there?" I swallowed. Peace, but also sorrow, and something else, like I was witnessing something I wasn't supposed to, but had been allowed to. He said nothing for a long while. Then, he reached for a leather-bound book on the shelf beside him and opened it to a bookmarked page. "You may not remember," he said, "but during the war, there was a young man from our village, Ramiro Ortega. He served in the north and never returned. His body was never found. But before he left, he used to come to the chapel every night to pray, always alone, always just before midnight." He turned the book toward me. An old photo, grainy but clear enough, a young man in uniform, standing before the chapel steps. "People say," Father Miguel continued, "that Ramiro made a promise before he left, that if anything were to happen to him, he would still return, not for vengeance, not for closure, but to pray, to finish the prayers he never got to complete." I stared at the photo. I couldn't say for certain it was the same man. The shadows, the hood, the bowed head. I had never seen the face clearly, but there was something in the posture, in the solemnity of the stance. It felt familiar. Could it be? I asked. Father Miguel shrugged softly. "I don't know, but sometimes, Marta, the soul remembers what the body forgets." I left the rectory with more questions than answers, but I also left with a strange sense of peace. Not certainty. No, nothing about that night was certain, but peace, nonetheless. Sometimes, that's all we are given, and sometimes, it's enough. Chapter 5. The Old Mass Book. It was 3 nights later before I returned to the chapel. I don't know why I waited. Maybe I needed time to absorb what Father Miguel had told me, or maybe part of me was afraid. Not of the man, not exactly, but of what his presence meant, of what it stirred inside me. I had prayed for peace that night, and in return, something had been revealed, something that refused to be neatly folded away. I decided to bring a candle with me this time, a tall, white one I'd been saving for Easter. It felt right, though I couldn't explain why. There was something sacred in the act of lighting a single, pure flame for someone I might never fully understand. The air was crisp again, but the snow had stopped. The path to the chapel was clear. My steps sure. I held the candle in one hand, the matches in the other, and as I approached, I felt a familiar hush settle around me, like the chapel recognized me, like it was waiting. Inside, the scent of old stone and melted wax wrapped around me like a shawl. The chapel was exactly as I'd left it, and yet, somehow, it wasn't. I knelt. The wooden pew creaked beneath me, the way it always did. I placed the candle on the small stand near the front and struck a match. The flame caught quickly, its light gentle, almost hesitant. I closed my eyes, lowered, I whispered, "I don't know who he was, but I know he was yours." I prayed without words for a while, letting my thoughts drift like smoke. I prayed for peace, for souls in waiting, for the forgotten. And then, as I leaned forward to rest my hands on the edge of the pew, I saw it, a book. It rested on the kneeler where the man had sat, a leather-bound missal. I had never seen it there before. The cover was cracked with age, its corners worn. A rosary with dark wooden beads lay tucked inside, as though marking a page. I reached out slowly, the way one might reach for something fragile or holy. The moment I touched it, I felt a strange chill, not cold exactly, but an awareness, like stepping into a memory not your own. I opened it. The pages were brittle, yellowed with time. The text was handwritten in beautiful, looping script, Latin, Spanish, occasionally both. But what caught my eye wasn't the prayers. It was the heading on the page where the rosary had been placed. Misa por las almas olvidadas, Mass for the forgotten souls. My breath caught. It was written in ink so faded it looked like ash. But it was there, clear, intentional. I turned the page. On the inside cover, written in a different hand, smaller, more rushed, was a single line. He was here. He prayed. Pray for him. The ink was brown, tinged with the irregular flow of an old fountain pen, the kind that hadn't been used in decades. I stared at the words, my fingers trembling slightly. He was here. He prayed. Pray for him. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even a request. It was a statement, a record, and I knew, without needing to ask how, that it referred to the man I had seen. I looked around the chapel, suddenly aware of how very still everything was. The candle flame didn't move. The air didn't stir. Even the wood of the pews seemed to be listening. My hands closed the book gently, as though sealing a sacred moment inside. Who had written it? Someone long before me? Or, impossibly, had it appeared only now? I didn't know, and somehow, it didn't matter. All I knew was that this man, whoever he had been in life, was not merely a visitor. He was a soul still bound to this place. And he had prayed, with sorrow, with devotion, with the kind of longing only eternity can hold. I whispered a prayer aloud then, my voice echoing softly through the chapel. Lord, receive him into the light of your face. Do not forget him, as the world has, as we so often forget each other. The candle flickered once, a small, sudden sway, and then returned to stillness. And in that stillness, I felt it again, that sacred weight, that quiet knowing. He had been here, he had been real, and he was still waiting. Chapter 6. The Story of San Ramiro. It was on the following Sunday, after Mass, that I found myself alone once more with Father Miguel. The church was quiet, emptied of parishioners, the lingering smell of incense still hanging faintly in the air. He was seated near the altar, his hands resting on his knees, staring at the flickering red sanctuary lamp. There was a look on his face, not troubled, exactly, but distant, like someone remembering a place they hadn't visited in years. I approached, hesitating just before the front pew. You knew something, didn't you? I asked gently, even before the book, before I told you what I saw. Father Miguel nodded once. Not new, Suspected. There's a difference. He gestured for me to sit. I did. The chapel felt colder than usual. Or maybe I was just more aware of the spaces between things now. The distance between one breath and the next. Between what is seen and what is felt. You've heard of Ramiro Ortega? He asked. I nodded. You mentioned him before. The soldier. Yes. But I didn't tell you the whole of it. I wasn't sure if I should. But now, I think you're part of it, whether you want to be or not. He paused, looking down at his hands. Ramiro was born in this village, raised just a few houses from where you live now. He was one of those rare souls, kind, quiet, devout, the sort who didn't draw much attention, except for how deeply he cared. During the war, he joined the army not out of pride, but out of duty. Said he couldn't sit idly by while his friends were being sent off. Father Miguel's voice dropped lower. He used to come here, to this chapel, every night before he left. Sometimes just to sit, sometimes to cry. He lit candles for each of his companions, those already gone and those yet to fall. He wrote their names in the margins of his prayer book. Dozens of names. I could picture it. A young man, bent in prayer, whispering names into the stone. He wrote letters home. Father Miguel continued, but one day, the letters stopped. Word came from a soldier who'd been with him. They were making their way home. Ramiro had taken a detour up the mountain near the pass. Said he needed one last moment of prayer. Said he had something to finish. Father Miguel looked up at me. He never came down. The room felt still. They searched for days. He went on, weeks, even, but the snow had begun to fall, and the mountain swallowed him whole. No body, no footprints, only his pack, found near an old shrine. The village mourned, but even in mourning, there was unease. People said the mountain had taken him for a reason, that he had chosen to go, to offer himself. I felt a chill then, the kind that begins at the spine and travels slowly outward. A year later, Father Miguel said quietly, a terrible storm struck the village. Torrential rains, flooding, a lightning strike on the roof of this very chapel, and on the night of the worst downpour, one of the elders, Doña Elvira, swore she saw someone praying inside. She'd gone to check for damage, and through the slats of the wooden door, she saw a man kneeling in front of the altar, completely dry. He let the words sink in. There have been more stories since. Every few years, always on a night of sorrow, a plague, a war, a tragedy, someone sees him or hears him, a low voice, whispering the names of the dead, a shadow that walks without sound, candles lit that no one remembers lighting. I swallowed, thinking of the night I wasn't alone. Some call him San Ramiro now. Father Miguel added, it's not official, of course. The church hasn't recognized anything. But among the people, the old ones especially, they believe. Not in fear, but in gratitude. They say his soul returned, not for vengeance or rest, but to continue what he started, to pray, to intercede. I looked toward the statue of Saint Martin de Porres. The night I saw him, I said softly, that statue, it glowed. Just for a second, like it breathed light. Father Miguel closed his eyes, nodded slowly. Martin is the patron of souls in purgatory. He said, a healer, a companion for the forgotten. I felt the rosary in my pocket, my fingers curling around it. Do you think it really was him? Father Miguel opened his eyes. I think, he said, that some prayers are too strong to die with the body. I think some souls are so bound by love that they return. Not as ghosts, but as echoes of grace. He leaned forward, his voice gentler than ever. And I think, Marta, that he chose you, not because you were special, but because you were there. Because you listened, because you didn't run. I didn't know what to say. Outside, the bells in the tower began to toll the hour. A soft, solemn sound, time moving forward, even as the past stirred beneath our feet. That night, I returned to the chapel once more. I brought no candle, no matches, only the book, and a heart cracked open by wonder. I knelt in silence, and somewhere, I believe, he was kneeling too. Chapter 7. A Night of Peace. I waited until the moon was high. There was no real reason for the timing, except that something within me said, now. There was no snow that night, only the quiet hush of winter wrapped around the village. The sky so clear it felt like the stars had drawn closer just to witness what might unfold. In my coat pocket, I carried 3 candles, one for the Lord, one for Our Lady, and one, the smallest, for the soul who had come to pray beside me. The one who had whispered sorrow and wrapped the chapel in stillness. I had no name for him, only the weight of his presence and the strange, holy echo he left behind. The chapel door opened easier than usual. Perhaps the hinges were grateful for the visit. I stepped inside, the silence greeting me like an old friend. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The pews stood as they always did, bowed from years of prayer. The altar cloth was crisp and white. The statue of Saint Martin watched quietly from his niche, a worn rosary slung across his arm. I knelt, not from habit this time, but from invitation, like the chapel had been holding a space for me, not to ask for anything, but to witness, to keep vigil. I lit the first candle. For you, Lord, I whispered. The flame caught quickly, strong and steady. The second, for Our Lady, who comforts even the loneliest soul. The third, for him. The smallest candle hesitated before it burned. Its flame trembled, as if unsure, then flared gently to life. I sat back, hands folded, and let the silence gather. Time passed. I don't know how long. The night is different in a chapel. It stretches and breathes. It listens, and sometimes it speaks. The candles flickered softly, casting long shadows across the walls. My breath was slow, my eyes half closed, and then a sound. Barely anything. A gentle creak. The chapel door, though shut, stirred ever so slightly. The movement wasn't forceful. It didn't startle me. It was like someone passing through with great care, not to disturb, but to say, thank you. Then, a breath. Not mine, not from outside, inside me, like a thought that wasn't mine but came from within. Gracias. One word, soft, gentle, full. It wasn't a voice, not in the way you'd hear through ears, but I felt it, deep in the marrow of my spirit, and with it came a warmth, not physical, but radiant, like the moment in prayer when you know you've been heard. Tears came easily, not out of fear, never fear, out of awe, to witness something sacred, something outside the bounds of time and logic, is to be made small in the best way. To remember that there are mysteries we are meant to hold, not solve. I cried because I had been entrusted with one of them. When the candles had burned down to their stubs, I remained a while longer, the wax puddling slowly beneath the flames. And when I finally rose to leave, I glanced once more toward the place where he had sat, empty, but not vacant. I opened the chapel door slowly. The air outside was cool and still. No wind, no footsteps, just a peace that lingered like incense. As I walked home under the stars, I felt no need to look behind me. Whatever had been needed had been fulfilled. Later that week, I told Father Miguel everything. He listened, his hands steepled under his chin, eyes closed. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he smiled, a deep, weary smile, the kind that comes from carrying many secrets and finally seeing one set free. We should honor him, he said, every year, on this night, a mass, not just for him, but for all like him, the ones forgotten by history, by family, the ones who wait. So now, each year, the chapel fills at midnight. People come with candles, some bring photos, some only bring silence, but they come, and I light 3 candles, always, one for the Lord, one for Our Lady, and one for the man in the shadow, who once prayed beside me, and whispered thank you, before stepping back into the mystery. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing some people have entertained angels without knowing it. Hebrews chapter 13 verse 2. I think about that verse often now. Before all of this, it was just a pleasant line of scripture, something you might hear in a Sunday homily and forget by lunch. But now it lingers, now it echoes. It has shape and breath and memory, because I know what it feels like to open a door at midnight and sense that the person who entered did not belong to this world anymore. I don't pretend to understand all of it. That night, those nights, they're not things I can explain away. I've gone over the details again and again. I've questioned myself. I've doubted and believed and doubted again. But each time I close my eyes and picture the pew where he sat, I feel the same thing. Peace, a sorrowful peace, heavy, reverent, the kind that only follows the footsteps of a soul who knows eternity not as a promise, but as a reality. We forget people. That's one of the tragedies of life. Names fall off prayer lists. Graves go untended. Photographs yellow. The living move on. But heaven doesn't forget, and I believe, with a certainty that bypasses logic, that sometimes God allows us to be reminded, not with thunder, not with visions, but with a quiet presence, a whispered prayer, a flicker in the candlelight. Ramiro Ortega may have died in the snow decades ago, but his soul never stopped praying. It remained tethered to this earth not by anger or fear, but by love, by duty, by devotion, and in that chapel, I bore witness to his final vigil. I don't think I was chosen for it. I think I was simply there with an open heart and a silence willing to hold something sacred. Sometimes I wonder if others have had similar moments and simply dismissed them. A breath of cold air where none should be, a shadow that lingers too long, a tear for no reason. Maybe we've all brushed up against eternity without knowing it. Maybe that's the miracle, not that it happened to me, but that it happens at all. Now, every time I walk into the chapel, I greet the shadows, not with fear, but with reverence. And each year, as we gather for the midnight mass for the forgotten, I light those same 3 candles. One for Christ, our light, one for Mary, our mother, and one for the man who reminded me that no soul, however long gone, is ever truly alone. The world rushes on, technology evolves, cities grow, names vanish, but prayers remain, and sometimes, in the quiet hush of a chapel, they return to us, wearing old boots and whispering Latin hymns, not to be seen, but to be felt. So if you ever find yourself awake at midnight, if the air shifts and you feel a presence you cannot explain, don't be afraid, welcome it. You may be entertaining a prayer long forgotten. You may be holding space for a soul that needed only one more moment. And you may never know the difference you made until heaven tells you so. No soul is forgotten. No prayer is wasted. What about you? Have you ever experienced something you couldn't quite explain? If this story touched something in your heart, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes, in life, we may find ourselves in moments like the woman in tonight's story, alone. Uncertain, but not entirely alone. Even in a world full of science and technology, there are still mysteries around us, spiritual moments that defy logic. And in those moments, all we can do is pray and ask God to help us recognize His will, even when it comes in whispers. We wish you a peaceful day, a restful night, and above all, don't forget to subscribe to Fogman Stories for more true Catholic spiritual encounters in the days to come. Thank you for watching. Stay blessed, always.